Hello everyone, Professor Philip Travis, and this week we are going to really start to get into studying the Cold War. The Cold War, which of course with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we very much see the Cold War roots of modern issues and crises very, very obviously. Of course, Ukraine, the map here, which I'll talk about in a moment, Ukraine is not even on the map. The country of Ukraine would be located right in here, with Belarus up to its north. And of course, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, the Baltic countries, are also not in this map either. They were considered during the Cold War part of the Soviet Empire proper, as opposed to these lighter shaded countries, which are your Warsaw Pact countries that were like pseudo-independent sort of puppet states of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So the Cold War refers to a period from 1945 to 1991, and historians do argue and debate a little bit about the 1945 beginning date. I have that there because it's kind of the easiest date for us, since that's the end of the Second World War. Though most historians, and the historian you're going to be reading from this week, would actually say that the Cold War's formal beginning was more like 1947, and this is because it's in 1947 where the United States begins the Truman Doctrine and its containment policy, which was the policy to remain sort of globally, or at least initially, it wasn't quite globally initially, mainly focused on areas of the Western world, but strong point areas. But long-term containment policy was the policy to remain globally prepared to contain the forces of Soviet communism wherever it might spread. That's where the policy ultimately developed, particularly by 1950. And I'll talk about the map here in just a moment. What makes the Cold War a very unique point in history? It's more than just two countries sort of having some tension. Okay? What makes the Cold War unique is that it was a period of time, almost a half century, where the world was really divided, really effectively into three major camps, though for the practicality of discussing the two major superpowers, it's a period of a bipolar world where the United States and its allies associated with democratic capitalism were effectively engaged in a non-shooting struggle with the Soviet Union and its communist authoritarian allies. The world was divided. These two elements did not engage in normal economic, political, diplomatic relations. The world was divided along those lines, and that's what makes it unique. Now, the third one that I mentioned is there are countries in the world that are called non-aligned countries at this time. Austria, for example, which is right here, would have been a non-aligned country. India was a non-aligned country. Egypt was a non-aligned country. And what that meant, Yugoslavia, which was a communist country, but was a non-aligned country right here in the green. It no longer exists, of course. What that meant to be a non-aligned country was that they were not taking sides one way or another, and they were sort of happy to work and make arrangements and trade agreements and so forth with either the Western, the United States side, or the Soviet communist in its side. So what makes the Cold War unique is that it represents the development of large-scale bipolarity in the world, where the two major world hegemonic powers, the Soviet Union, the United States and its allies, the Soviet Union and its allies, were effectively divided. They were not in any way, shape, or form regularly or in a meaningful sense participating in normalized trade, economics, diplomacy, politics, and so forth. That's what really makes it unique. And of course, with the crisis, the invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a sovereign country in Ukraine, the most extensive overt war in the greater sort of European region, since World War II, and of course directly on the frontier of NATO, that conflict very much, it's very, very dangerous. It's very concerning. The worst case scenario would be, of course, a large-scale continental European war that could develop into a world war. That would be the worst case scenario, obviously. But another potential scenario is that we could actually be witnessing the emergence of another Cold War, in the sense that Russia, its greater area of influence in the world, its closest allies, and the United States may in fact be in the process of sort of another phase of division and bipolarity. And certainly if you look at the scale of the sanctions currently imposed on Russia as a reaction to this blatant violation of international law, it seems very possible that the world could be heading towards another Cold War, another area, a period of intense and potentially hostile division between the sort of Russian Eastern world and the Western U.S. supporting world. So that is a distinct concern. Here is a map of the NATO countries, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which of course I'm sure everyone is now pretty aware of this, as this has been a major conversation surrounding the issue with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But this is a map of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, around about early 1980s, 1981. Warsaw Pact was basically the Soviet Union's reaction to NATO. So NATO is an alliance system. All of the countries of NATO have formed an alliance to provide for collective defense against, in this case, the potential threat of the Soviet Union. So a reaction to World War II, where Europe really wasn't strongly united, it wasn't strongly prepared, and as a result of that, really opened the door for Germany, Nazi Germany, to attempt to overrun, not attempt, it did overrun all of Europe, and then of course carry out a horrifying genocide. So the result of that is the formation of NATO, ultimately designed to create an alliance system and to create collective security and preparedness against what, at the outset of the Cold War, was clearly the primary threat, and that was the threat potentially posed by the Soviet Union, albeit perhaps that threat was exaggerated a little bit by the United States and its Western allies, but the reason for this was, of course, to oppose that threat. And the Warsaw Pact was sort of the Soviet Union's version of that. The numbers that you see on here are references to military strength and troop numbers during the height of the Cold War. And, of course, these are your Warsaw Pact countries. Today, of course, the Cold War ended, of course, in 1991. And by the late 90s, early 2000s, many of the, pretty much all of the former Warsaw Pact states were incorporated into NATO. Of course, this was East Germany. The little dot here is Berlin, which is a divided city within the heart of East Germany during the Cold War. Of course, Germany is reunited. Poland becomes a part of NATO. Czechia and Slovakia, this is Czechoslovakia, today's two countries, is part of NATO. Hungary is part of NATO. Romania is part of NATO. Albania is part of NATO. Even up here, the Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia are all part of NATO. And of course, with the Cold War, Ukraine, located here, becomes an independent nation, particularly recognized under the Budapest Accord of 1994. So, the factoid is this. I want you to summarize this. The causes of the Cold War were really twofold. On the one hand, part of the cause of the Cold War had to do with the fact that the United States held the only atomic bomb. And so the atomic weapons monopoly for the United States was a factor in the inability of the Soviet sphere and the U.S. sphere to sort of come to agreements on things. The U.S. atomic monopoly was highly controversial from the Soviet perspective, and there were questions in the then-founded United Nations about what might be done about the U.S. atomic monopoly because of the sort of imbalance with respects to power and war making in the world. And of course, nuclear weapons then become a really inherent part of the Cold War. The Cold War is usually almost always associated with a fear of nuclear war, and of course, the two sides build up massive amounts of nuclear arsenals. In the early 1970s, each side had roughly 30,000 nuclear warheads. Today, the number is much lower. I believe the Russians' arsenal is somewhere around 5,000. The United States is it's a little higher than that. But they're two very, very, very powerful and large nuclear powers. And indeed, when we look today, clearly the threat and concern about nuclear weapons and the potentiality of nuclear war has obviously not gone away. And indeed, the concern over that is perhaps in our current crisis today greater than it's ever been, minus perhaps only the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that is deeply concerning. And one of the reasons why the U.S. and NATO are going to such lengths to try to avoid anything that might result in an expansion of the war in Ukraine. The other factor in the lead up to the Cold War was the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe. These territories in here were all, of course, territories that were conquered by Nazi Germany. And in the process, the Soviet Union at the end of the war, as the United States and the USSR on certain areas were unable to compromise, but in general, Stalin and the Soviet Union sought a buffer region, not unlike the claims made by Putin about Ukraine needing to be a buffer region to the West. Stalin sought a buffer region to what he thought to be the threatening Western world. And so the Soviet Union occupied these countries in Central and Eastern Europe. And this occupation, really a forced occupation, was a major reason for the emergence of the Cold War, as it was really not acceptable for the United States to recognize regions that were clearly occupied territories. And so summarize the two big causes and sort of elements, symptoms, if you will, of the Cold War: atomic weapons, the eventual nuclear arms race, which begins after the Soviet detonation of an atomic bomb in 1949, and the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, which of course occurs following the end of World War II.